Welcome to Emerging Issues in Science and Society 2024, the futures of work. But I can actually, when I look at all your brilliant faces, I can feel this is really about the future of mankind, really, the future of humanity. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered here today. We pay our respects to their elders and ancestors and thank them for allowing us to have our gathering on their land. I extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Education has a long and rich heritage on this continent, which we aim to honour and reflect in the ways we teach and learn. I won't repeat that for the people online, but we welcome the people online as well. My name is Vicky Huang. I'm the Deputy Convener of the SSN. And as you know, one of the goals of today is to listen to our wonderful speakers, but also network and get to know one another. So if you don't mind, could you please turn and introduce yourself to somebody you don't know? Just take a moment and please introduce yourself. And for people online, welcome you as well. Feel free to type an introduction into the chat. To do so, make sure you are logged into YouTube to access the chat. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I can feel the energy building. It's very exciting to have you all here. I can feel it's going to be a fabulous day, so thank you so much. As you know, I'm also the timekeeper for today, so apologies if you hear me tapping a little bit. Just some admin. There's water just here and snacks. Please feel free to refresh yourself at any time. There's also coffee and tea outside, which might then lead to needing the bathroom, which is on your way to the lifts on the far side of the wall. If you would like to post about us on social media, please use the hashtag EISS 2024. I would like to thank our Chief Administrator, Karina Traits. She's been fantastic. Also acknowledge our convener, Radhika Guru, who you'll see quite a lot of today. If you've got any questions at all, please ask any of the three of us. We're happy to help you with admin or anything else. Also, if you'd like to not be in any photographs, please let Karina know. You know, bad lighting, witness protection, you never know. Happy to exclude you from photographs as well. Now, I would like to invite Radhika to introduce our program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky. It's always so exciting when you've been planning a day for a long time and it's finally here, right? I want to say a little bit about the Science and Society Network, which was actually started by Emma, who's sitting in the audience here, in 2017, I believe. And we are just a network of, which seeks to combine the strengths of the natural and the social sciences to kind of address and think about problems confronting society today. One of the key annual events in our busy calendar is what we call EISS, which stands for Emerging Issues in Science and Society. So we do different formats of it. And this year, we're going to have this format of having a keynote by Payal Arora, who's here from Utrecht University, and who will talk about the feminist futures of work. And then we'll have a moderated roundtable discussion with different disciplinary perspectives on the futures of work. And then we'll have an education panel, which looks at youth education and intergenerational justice. Now, if you Google futures of work, future of work, as it's usually called, you'll find lots and lots of stuff on the internet. You'll find TED Talks and you'll find kind of reports from like the Deloittes of the world. And much of the discussion centers around jobs being replaced by AI and what it might mean for skill gaps and so on. But there's so much more to this notion of futures of work. We need to explore where ideas about the future come from and what priorities and knowledges these are based on. And we need to understand how different fields of expertise are conceptualizing the future and how they're reorganizing the present in light of these anticipated futures. And most importantly, we need to think not only about what kind of work the future needs, but also what kind of work we can do today to kind of create the futures that we'd like to have. So we'll kick off these discussions with a keynote by Payal. And as I said, we'll have then the panel and then the roundtable. Sorry, the roundtable and then the panel. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Payal Arora. Now, if you look for Payal's official bio, you'll find plenty on the internet. You can read all about her fantastic qualifications and Harvard and Columbia, and her research and her string of books. And she also has a not quite professional bio, which is the one that I'd like to introduce her by. Payal was born in India, and she lived actually her early years in my home city of Bangalore. But she was shipped off to San Francisco in her teens after causing much trouble with her Marxist artistic experiments in Kerala. And instead of starting her own Hare Krishna club in California, she waitressed and did street art. And that was a perfect combination to remind her that poverty wasn't that sexy after all. So she sold her soul and became an art dealer, selling expensive art with the right mix of cheap wine and cheese. But thankfully, this career was interrupted by her love affair with New York, where she stumbled upon research and into research. And she came, in came her passion for global culture, technology, communication, and she pursued these by accumulating some good old Ivy League degrees. And so that she could say stuff like, I went to school in Boston. Since then, she's been studying digital usage among the global poor and consulting for numerous public and private sector institutions like Adobe, Spotify, KPMG, UNESCO, etc. And to prove that she's not just, kind of traveling around the world eating good food, she also publishes the odd article or book, like every couple of days. She's currently professor of inclusive AI, or rather, I should say, including AI cultures at Utrecht University, and she calls Amsterdam her home at the moment. So you're very welcome, Payal. Come and blow us away.
Thank you so much, Radhika. So yeah, it was one of my top bios because I did shift careers remarkably from a very different field. So it looks like I'm in a good audience here. I was an art dealer and then I moved to, around, and as Radhika caught a snippet of my life. But then I had to demote that not quite, official bio because people were panicky, especially in Europe where they wanted the official one to justify the getting me over. So anyways, I'm glad you got that. It's lovely to be here, and I already see a wonderful synergy. I just moved to Utrecht University the beginning of this year, and I'm part of this new group called Contesting Governance, which is very similar to this group actually, where we are bringing geoscientists together with multiple different faculties to just firstly build a common language so we can have a conversation, because it's not just humankind and mankind, it's a humanity kind, as Don Norman would say, is what we need to start to design, where we're thinking on a multiplicity of levels, right? Not just for societal good, but also planetary good. But the other thing is, of course, when you, as Radhika said, like go through the future of work, on the internet, there's already a rising critique, saying that the future is now, right? Because when you say the futures of work, just of futures of anything, you push responsibility to the next generation, or you connote that it is something that can only happen down the line, when actually much of it has to happen right now, because we cannot afford a lost generation, whether it's in education. We cannot afford a lost generation when it comes to the environment. So actually it is about the work in progress that matters. And so with that said,
One more further.
Okay. And I was going to introduce all these people and make up fake bios. Okay, but too bad, lost opportunity. All right. So today I'm going to talk about this feminist design principles for the future of global work. Now, why do I use futures of work still, considering I agree with the critique, is because of common ground. We need to sometimes take common ground terms and then complicated, then, disrupted. Because, we academics otherwise can never get anywhere with other stakeholders. We're like, yes, but that's a problem term. That ends the conversation, right? So moving forward is that, what's interesting is feminist approaches towards, design and of multiple sectors and systems have become fashionable again. Shall we say feminism has become very retro, right? So you see femtech on the rise, you see feminist thinking, feminist design, feminist internet. In fact, there's a whole host of things which is now, on the rise. And what does that actually mean? When it comes to work, feminist thinkers have long been preoccupied by work, as many of you may already know, from the beginnings of equal pay, which was still critiqued for, subscribing to the system at place, to a much more sophisticated notion of feminism as disrupting the very patriarchal systems. And why do we need to play by those very rules, right? And now to a much more complicated understanding that it's not just about, disrupting and, breaking down these systems. It's about building something which matters not just for women, but for across society, but also now including the planet, right? So today I'm going to be addressing what does that actually look like, not in sort of abstract terms, but much more concrete terms, because I'm an anthropologist and I spent about 2 decades looking at how marginalized populations, particularly in the global South, are using digital tools to, make a sense of their everyday lives, but also to exercise agency, improve their living conditions, decrease loneliness, and a variety of, motivations that keep us human, right? So I will speak a little bit about positionality. The FemLab initiative I, came up with alongside Usha Raman, the co-founder at University of Hyderabad, some years ago, just in time, a month before the pandemic. So we received all this money to do ethnographic research in the global South, which is such a dream come true. And I will share that with you. The FairWork design principles and how we sort of push against that and make it into the FemWork principles and why. And that's connected to the rise of femtech, right? And we situate the, our research of everyday experiences of women workers in particular in the global South, particularly South Asia, and how they will use these digital platforms, these so-called gig platforms across different sectors, and how that has shaped our notions of FemWork. So some years ago, I wrote this book called The Next Billion Users, which was basically capturing my 2 decades of research across different countries in the global South, really pushing against this notion of these exoticization of the marginalized majority or the majority world, right? Where you have all these multiple narratives. No, the global poor are really virtuous, right? That every time you look at poor, surely they are victims, and no, they're also perpetrators. They are some of the key people who work in the black market. They're the ones who are scamming you. They're the ones, because these are survival tactics, right? Not to rationalize it, but not to also romanticize these groups. Or, for example, agencies that, no, they're beneficiaries. And then there was a flip that, no, they actually, they are super beings, right? So if you see the TED Talk like Sagatha Mitra and the Hole in the Wall that promotes this notion that the average global South child will do something that no Western child can do. They can learn chemistry, biology, just with a click of the button. And the guy got $1 million because people just love this idea of these, global South leapfrogging into the future, right? So basically what you have is all these crazy narratives, which basically confuse the majority of world to the average policymaker, designer. And so they feel, no wonder they replicate what they know, which is a sliver of the world's populations, and, use that as a starting point. I mean, it helps to know that 90% of young people live outside the West, right? So we really are not representative of the world. Moreover, we are 5% of the countries in the world today are liberal democracies. So we are again not representative. So given the fact that we are in this tiny slice and we are using that mindset to replicate designs and policies for the rest of the world, I sort of pushed back against that. And what was fascinating is this came out in 2019, and around that time, every big tech company came up with their own next billion user group. And I thought that was really interesting. So instead of chasing after tech companies started chasing after me. Every major tech company was inviting me with a red carpet, hoping I'd deliver the next million users to them, because it's a different kind of economy. The future of work is now, completely platformized or datafied or whatever term you want to use, and it's permeating across sectors. There's no field that is, impervious to it, right? And so, whether it's Spotify, Google, across board, they all know that the majority of their markets, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, for instance, right? China is a different beast. Often better to contain them so one can catch up, actually, if you follow the politics of, Elon Musk and China. So whether it's to do with fintech, AVs, etc., and that's a different story. But that being said, is that what was interesting is that it is still looked upon as a market you can extract, but not where you can co-create. And I think that's something which is still a problem. So these tech companies are still not changing their mindset about how they look at the rest of the world. It's more about how do I go into that world and, just get their data so as to build, tools and products and services for them to consume without taking into consideration the cultural context. But still from a consumption side, but not from the production side, right? Like these are also producers, these are also workers in these systems. So a couple of years ago, Usha and I, applied for this grant from IDRC, and we got this wonderful generous funding to look at marginalized women workers using these platforms across these sectors: sanitation, artisanal, garment, salon, and construction. And actually, I realized you're missing the ride-hailing sector. That came a little later, but also ride-hailing sector. So we looked at 6 sectors, and over a course of 3 years, and that was actually really exciting. Even actually, in a sense, it was the silver lining of COVID, because it happened right a month before COVID hit, right? Is that we caught the rawness of what, for example, India, Bangladesh, and other countries, and Kenya were going through, in terms of they had to fast come up with a fintech system. Within like 2 months, Bangladesh came up with their own fintech system so as to deliver resources directly to people who could not work. So we were able to capture that dynamism, which is quite a rare feat. So, as a researcher, you put a hat of like, okay, how do I optimize this current shitty situation? But also what happened was that we started to talk to stakeholders who were, confined to their homes, and from politicians to designers to entrepreneurs and tech company founders and activists. And they all had these deep engagements and they wanted to engage. So we created a blog space, just so because we couldn't go into the field. And the blog space, we made sure that it was personalized. It had to be not some sort of website kind of rubbish, but it had to come from their own personal vantage point. And we had these amazing stories, like the head of Nokia was giving a very, sort of visceral story to Web Foundation. And then he said, okay, here's a book. So we basically, extended it, and we have now an open access book called Feminist Futures of Work, where 2/3 are non-academic. So they're literally coming from Adobe, Web Foundation, UNHCR, very different worlds. Nokia, like I said, a lot of different, Mishu, which is a platform company for reselling, etc. And then we have some activists and academics. And the idea is to see that from all these different perspectives, how people, are looking at work, what are their challenges, what are their experiences, and how they're navigating it through, right? So the FemLab actually started in a very interesting organic manner. This is just the beginning. I realize I haven't even updated that team. It's become quite much bigger, actually, about add another 10 people. So, but what's interesting is that we have really, it's also part of the academic space that we are in. Academia is becoming more, in a way, we're embracing interdisciplinarity, say, in a context like this. On the other hand, we have our politics are becoming, in many ways, very much of an obstacle, I have to say. So there's so much competition because, like the Hunger Games in academia, as everyone is experiencing budget cuts, you're being pitted against one another. Collegiality is going out of the window, and oftentimes who you need to work with, oftentimes are closer by, but they're also your competitors because you're too close in profile that it's one of you wins, right? And so we thought, okay, we really need to come up with a space where it doesn't matter what institution you're in, but if you have work that if you're interested in this kind of work, then we need to come together. And also particularly the people who are starting at different career levels. So we were providing mentorship systems, especially, this has all happened during COVID, right? And we had this monthly meetings and open to across different groups. So now we have a team that's spread out in Zurich, in the US, in Canada, many parts of Africa, India, across board. And we do work. And so when we get third sector money, we have a team already in so many parts of the world that I can say, oh, this is third sector money from Grab, interest in East Asia, who's the FemLab team there, and we initiate something. And it's been very, very useful. And I think academia needs more of these sort of out of the box thinking where we can work together on papers, conferences, collaborations, which doesn't put institutional, barriers, and you don't need institutions to bring it together, right? So because also the PhDs keep in touch, because oftentimes they are isolated in their own faculty because nobody's working in the global south, for example, very common problem. So their mentors are zero interested in their work, right? And here they find an entire world where they're completely dedicated to these areas. And I think that's really something powerful. So going into so that's just a little side note, but going back to the core subject of the futures of work, right, is the FemWork design principles. It's like, initiated at Oxford University, Oxford Internet Institute by Mark Graham and team, and now it's spread out, and they're doing really good work. They're working with ILO, International Labour Organization, etc. And so one of the things is that they're trying to regulate the gig economy for the, in the global south. Of course, that term gig is very problematic because the gig, comes from, again, a westernized notion of, part-time work, like, hobby work, or you add on work, and it's often from the music industry, and it's got a very specific etymology, right? But the majority of world, right, has always been so-called gig because they are informal economies for the longest part. 60 to 80% are informal in nature, but informal doesn't mean illegal or gray. There are rules at play, but it definitely demands a certain kind of formalization. But it's also a very sticky factor. But things are changing rapidly because of digitization, and we can talk a little bit more. But for them, gig economy is a full-time job. Actually, if you're an Uber driver in South Africa or in Vietnam, that's a full-time job. But the difference is that you have multiple platforms, and we'll speak more about it. So you're actually working, sometimes even 60 hours a week. And, but the key benefit is flexibility. And this is actually going to be the future of work for the West. I think we have to think about how is our work going to transform, and we're not used to learning from the global South to the global North because we don't think that these contexts, resonate because they're too alien, right? But it's almost like we are experimenting with different forms of how things can be, right? Now, like, for example, during one of the initiatives India has introduced is recognizing that people do enjoy flexibility. They don't want to be, imprisoned by one company. And I think you may all resonate with this a little bit, right? Like, I like my university, but not that much. I don't mind, being part of multiple universities if I could. as an academic, right? Like, what if we were to pick and choose a bit? Like, I would take some course, teach some courses here, have a contract there, and it shouldn't be so complicated. And actually, this new generation really wants this kind of flexibility and freedom. In fact, the way in which they're choosing the kind of jobs they can engage with very much demands certain flexibility. And you see this happening already here, right? So, but we are very conservative in our thinking about it. But Indian government has introduced something called, a basic security net. And this happened again during COVID, and it was initiated within literally a few months, where all gig economy platforms have to contribute X percentage of their profit to a common pool, like a social security net. So if anything happens to the gig workers, they are compensated from that pool, which is really actually an interesting out of the box idea. And this is the kind of concrete things we need to have in order to proceed for a different form of work, right? But so while these principles, like one of the key principles of fair work is they've been campaigning for, better, like how algorithms are measuring time, right? Like, and the value for time. So, for example, it's literally 3 seconds between gigs, right? Like whether you're a ride share or a few seconds, which is inhumane. So and then you get penalized if you don't respond, etc. So the way in which these systems are designed, they're like, no, it needs to be designed in a way which is more humane, which allows for a little more bandwidth, as well as the value for that time has to be higher. Fair enough, right? Or the profits are not worth their wealth, where it's because of this, it's like to the lowest common denominator, because say if you're the fastest delivery person, right, for a delivery app, then the system calibrates and comes up the average, which is lower, and so it makes it even more ruthless a system. So basically, this recalibration based on how people are using the system can be very dangerous for workers, because they feel they need to do more. It's like a race to the bottom, right? So we need to have, just like you have a minimum wage, you need to have a decent standard of what is acceptable, because it's causing a lot of accidents actually. Also for pedestrians, you're walking and you're like cursing these Uber, bikes, at least in the Netherlands, they're like scooting around all the time. And I always feel I'm going to get run down, but there's a reason why they're so urgently delivering it. We as consumers also are demanding an immediate, gratification, right? Then not all problems can be solved with automated responses, right? Because they want live supervisors, because oftentimes the criticism is that, well, it's become so inhumane because you cannot speak to anyone. Everything is automated. So you can just put there's no redressal system, which is also another key intervention that needs to be in place for any kind of future work, because we do need the human in the loop. And it's not human in the loop at one point, in every stage, to keep them at check, right? To make sure the system is humane. And last is worker power, right? There needs to be a sort of collective bargaining space, just like you see already happening in the US with Amazon workers. For the first time, they've actually won, right? And so it's to create, again, fair work conditions. So it's a renewal of the union systems. However, so all that, while we agree, there still needs to be a feminist approach. And here's why, right? Your time is worth more does not consider the pay gap. It looks at all workers as a sort of a monolithic unit. But there is a significant pay gap, especially in the global south, where it could be, a significant 60% difference between the pay between a woman worker and a male worker. The other is about, it's not just about being paid, but it happens in subtlety. You can say that, well, no, we are gender blind, right? But actually, the way in which the system is designed is like, say, if you take gigs in the night, you are looked upon as a more positive worker on the system, and then you get shown more and recommended more to the consumer. But it does not work for women workers. So they get, to the bottom of the recommendation system in this, and so that is a way, which means they get paid less. So you may see their outcome and say, hang on, why are they getting less work why they're getting less income per month is not because the system is technically sexist in that sense, but it's the structures at play which we assume that everyone's lives have the same kinds of freedoms and affordances, right? The other is about the profits are not worth their wealth, is that where it's so focused on safety in terms of accidents, etc., but not on safety like when it comes to women moving, in public spaces at different times. Understanding that safety for women is very different. Just getting into the cab and being with the men, right? And we had a number of incidents from our ride-hailing sector where women riders have developed multiple tactics to feel safe. So they pretend they're always calling their husband and they're talking to their husband while they're male customers, because they can't reject, right? Oftentimes also, even if you see a woman booking it, it could be for her husband or her brother. So that also doesn't give them that kind of freedom of where they can reject a customer, right? So, and so there's that safety means different things for women, particularly in the global south. And then about the autonomous response and automated responses, what we found was sometimes women preferred an anonymity because they felt they would be treated fairer. Because because of the gendered approaches towards women work, is that they would be treated as less serious, and so they had less bargaining power. So in fact, it was almost like in some point better to be, anonymous online, and there was some preference more so than with men. And the last about unions is, if you look at the nature of unions in majority parts of the world, it's very male dominated because it demands time, it demands structure. It doesn't, and women take disproportionate amount of care work onto their shoulders while they're working. So they cannot even participate in these unions. In fact, what they do is informal collectivities. Like, for example, we found a beautiful piece in the book by Amulya, one of our FemLab researchers, is about this sort of everyday engagements and collective sharing of tips and tricks about customers, but for urban companies, where they would share an auto, like 4 or 6 women, and then they would say, oh, avoid this guy, that guy's very creepy, oh, this person's really stingy, they're et cetera, et cetera. So how to navigate that customers, how to coordinate resources, how to pool resources. So that kind of collectivity and cooperative work actually is a foundational to running a society, but doesn't get acknowledged. In fact, during COVID, even in the US, there was a lot of cooperatives that sprung, and it was there was a beautiful article in the New Yorker which said if those cooperatives didn't exist, the US system would have collapsed during that time. But that didn't get recognized. It wasn't a formal, a lot of what happens in the US is very ground-based and spontaneous, and it continues in many different manifestations based so much on voluntary work, right? But so without taking into those considerations, we don't get a proper picture because we're still subscribing to rules which don't work for women, which is half the work. So when we how are we doing with time? So
10 o'clock, so there's 30 minutes to tea. There's some space for questions.
Okay, so 10 minutes more? Or? 10 minutes more, okay. So so femtech, as I said, is changed in many ways. People are very excited about femtech because finally women are being taken seriously, not just as entrepreneurs, right? Australia's one of the top celebrated icons is the CEO of Canva, for example, and people are very excited about it. But it's also happening across board, and venture capital companies are actually taking them seriously. Like this whole notion of, well, let's design for women by women, right? So money is being pivoted. But that being said, is that it's a huge industry already, like 50 billion, right? And it's looked upon almost as a source of good, but it's female tech is used synonymously with feminist tech, which is obviously not the same. And while we have a scarcity of data, so there's a data deficit, because in order to build systems that work for women, by women, you need the data. And we know that there's many across different sectors, much of the data, majority of the data is really primarily from male, middle class, white, Western, and so that's really very skewed, right? So you have to really exercise and be proactive in plugging that gap and getting the appropriate data. But the problem is that it also subjects you to, scrutiny, right? Like, for example, the menstruation app. It's perfect to track women's, cycles, and it can be deeply problematic where laws in the US, for example, on abortions, as this is a very popular example, it can signal to people that you're doing something illegal. If you missed a period and suddenly you're not having a baby, then what happened? Did you have an abortion? Did you take that pill? So there's a lot of precarity and also risk that it comes with this kind of, which is through the biometric monitoring economies, right? So in fact, if we look at actually femtech and the nature of the femtech initiatives, it's mainly tied very closely to women's bodies, right? So, all right, so I'm just gonna, so the notion here is about femtech is FemWork. So because tech is labor, the everyday engagements you do with technology is basically laborious, and that needs to be acknowledged. And why we came up with FemWork is we put work at the center of understanding these technologies, which allows us to be fairer, right? Which allows us to also think about valuing through diverse work forms, work times, and workplaces, right? So this basically also we need to go beyond the binary, which is basically whether you're a user, non-user, because as I said, you could be a non-user, you may not have a mobile phone, but you use it through your family. Like a Mishu app is a reselling platform. So the husband may do it, but the woman's doing the work, and then they may share the money comes to the family, or individual and collective, right? Where we noticed that when you had an app of, for example, the self-help apps, right? They share, they pool their resources to get a loan. That's a classic from the Muhammad Yunus, 80s. And that sort of revamped into the way in which people can pool resources through fintech and share it and give loans and, also track how people are using it, right? And flexible and formal, people want flexibility, but they also want formality. Formality, and we need to think about what formality then means. It means a certain level of security, humanity in terms of work conditions, what shouldn't be allowed, certain kinds of dignities, right? And it's not one or the other. Leisure and labor, what was interesting is that women are generally in the global south not used to, are not given the right to mobile phones because their reputation may be at stake. So, leisure is contentious because it may impact their reputation and thereby the family reputation, the community reputation. However, it's very legitimate for them to use mobile phones for work. So what we found is that they would be using it, and through that they could exercise much more of their self-expression and connect with other groups, have more kind of leisure, uninterrupted leisure in the guise of work, and even students are using that, and that allow them a larger sense of experiences. And care and efficiency, sometimes care can be much more efficient because you are putting the, say, for example, you cater to loneliness. If you are addressing that, then you're able to get out of your depression and be much more productive, right? And so it's not instrumental so much, but we need to understand care in very different dynamics, which is not against efficiency, right? And last is personal and professional, like I said, is that the person, we have this personal is political, but it's also professional. And so professional is political, right? And as I brought up in these examples. I think I'll end with this slide, which is basically when we talk about the rights, it should be, about right to access, right, of plural identities, like we talked about in terms of how do you put yourself, like in a concrete terms, during COVID, there was a migrant crisis, right? And one of the things that they had a real hard time was to disseminate the benefits to the migrants. So there's a huge pool of money for migrants, but 94% of, say, construction workers didn't get it, right? Which is made mainly of migrants. And that's because that they cannot claim to be a migrant. When you move because you're a farmer, you're getting subsidized, but farming is seasonal work. So you're a farmer, but you're also a gig worker in a city, but then you go back to farm. So there's this notion that, oh, the person from a rural area left farming for, you know, I don't know, ride hailing or urban services, but it's not the case. They hold multiple jobs. So it's not just a cross platform, it's across sectors, which complicates things because the system we have in design doesn't accommodate for that. And dignity, this is an example of GPS on women sanitation workers, and in the name of efficiency. And this has been very celebrated so they could track their movements to make sure they were covering the right areas. And if they didn't cover the full area, their salary would be docked automatically. So women got together and did major protests, and actually they won. They stopped sweeping and they actually won and became voluntary. But for now, we'll see, right? But these are the things, just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done, right? And right to refusal is where we shouldn't be penalized if you reject people's requests for services. In fact, companies need to have just as much a stringent policy on customers for bad behavior, where say 3 strike they're out or something, or they need to be penalized. And this could also have impact on other kinds of platforms where you have misbehavior, oftentimes misogynistic behavior. Even Twitter released a report saying that most of the hate speech is actually misogynistic speech. So there needs to be consequences on the customer, and they should not have that right to the platform. And this does come against, and we can talk a little more with tensions on privacy, because people are like, no, it shouldn't be associated with your actual identity because it puts you in a precarious position. But then it also allows us to make them accountable. So there's a trade-off, of course. And last is right to professional development. In Bangladesh, we were doing this research where everyone's like, okay, we need to upskill. So 70 to 80% of the artisanal sector is made up of women. But during the pandemic, and because of automation and digitization, there's a celebration that, yes, finally we can shift the industry. But then a lot of this, the managers were asking the women, why don't you send your sons over so they can take over your job, because this is now going to be much more digital oriented work, instead of investing in these very women who've been working in the sector for the last decade or so. And so the right to professional development, and I will stop there. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Payal. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions. Because we are also live streaming, please ask a question using the microphone. I'll pass that around. Introduce yourself briefly, and we welcome your questions. Do you have any questions? Online as well, please feel free to chat. Yeah, Emma?
Emma, are you looking?
Thank you, Payal. That was such an amazing talk. And there's so much to get into, to get our teeth into. I wanted to start with the value piece. And I think we can all see how this the race to the bottom, you were saying, in this kind of circularity of exploitation. It's this kind of the vision of this more and more efficient society. But the efficiency, of course, is at the cost of, of human lives and well-being. So how do we switch the kind of way that we see value that incorporates, human dignity, that incorporates the planet and sustainability? I mean, because we've got like companies doing their environmental and social whatever it's called, which I think a lot of people are quite cynical about. So yeah, how do you shift the value piece?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. So I think this is part of why we came up with FemWork and these different rights, because that connects directly to what people actually value from work, right? In terms of they do want dignity. Like it is so critical to one's sense of self. And that comes at the cost of higher pay, for example, like the whole joke of bad bosses, etc. But that behind it all, it's about respect, right? The respect that you are a human being, that you're not judged based on the work you do, but who you are, the kind of like sense of principles you have. But I think it's more important that these values that we hold dear shouldn't be relative. So different or double standards, right? That, oh, it applies to this, but not that context. I think we're in an interesting time period where we've lost our taste for universal anything or standards of certain kind, because so we've swung to the other side saying we need to constantly look at context, we need to look at cross-cultural values, religious values, etc. And then while we're trying to accommodate all this in a sense of inclusivity, what we're doing in many ways is losing sight of the fact that people, regardless of what their positionalities are, hold certain kinds of values dear, which is they want to be treated in a dignified manner. They want to have a decent, opportunity to, become better professionally, but also it doesn't mean, but multiple tracks. Professional doesn't mean that they are promoted. It means that they would gain more value, more opportunity, more responsibility, etc. So I think there's a way in which we can sense we need to invest in first recognizing what are contemporary values that bring us together and stand by, like, for example, also the environment, right? Well, regardless of what work you're in, every context wants an environment that they can feel safe, secure, but also it's good for their well-being, which is the air you breathe, to the food you eat. And I think the way in which we structure our lives has to be rethought about in a way where we can actually recognize that work is something we do so we can actually really flourish. This notion of human flourishing, and it is not the core of who we are and what we are supposed to be, right? So this would require that us sidelining it as central to our lives and something which is supplemental, like that, which means it should be flexible, right? I think flexibility is so key. It's such an enormous characteristic which is driving people across population. We were just talking the other day, even including PhDs. I thought that was very fascinating. Where University of Michigan, this is a decade ago, did this sort of new online initiative for PhDs, and they thought that PhDs would obviously choose in person as a priority over online, but actually more PhDs chose the online option. And in some sense, we shouldn't be so surprised, because as you grow older, you have a life, you have kids, you have relationships, and then you have to give that up for do long distance, as academics are like, used to be. I mean, it's part of the academic life now. And I think that also takes away from your mental, well-being. So there are reasons why people do what they do. And so let's just expand our choices. So these are just a variety of mechanisms that come down to values, not one monolithic thing. We need to invest in a standard set of values that permeates across cultures and contexts, across sectors, right? And that means that we have to also invest in systems like this safety net. It doesn't matter which sector you're in, everyone needs a safety net, particularly as technologies are disrupting our regular sectors, right? Because then if we have a safety net, we can get more enthusiastic about the potentials of new ways of being and doing, because we can resort to that safety net. And that's really essential. So that's something one can resonate with. So what can we do, which is building common ground to enable that value, but also understanding that value is tied to context, and it could become much more meaningful in terms of enforcement, in terms of specific kinds of policies, specific designs of platforms, and so as to go back into the fairness of a standard value system. So, but that's just a piecemeal answer to this.
Actually, great.
Maybe. We'll
I was
see.
going to say, while you're thinking.
Just wait till you hear my question before you say great. No, thank you so much. That was really fun talk. I'm just wondering, because we heard your informal bio, how does your earlier Marxism fit in with this? We're living in a situation where, you know, the global 1% have something like, what is it now, 60 or 70% of the world's wealth. So, I mean, it's you can't really leave it out of the picture, can you? And when we think about why some people are completely overworked, some people are struggling to find work, and other people, a very small percentage of people, hold almost all the world's wealth.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you say that, because I was actually having this conversation with someone, is that I actually have grown, so when I left home when I was a teenager, and I ran away from home with this group that, I don't know how many of you have heard of Black Mountain College. You know, it was this experimental thing in the 20s and 30s. So we thought we would come up with this Black Mountain College, which is basically, it's like a rule, you know, cut all the rules. I left college also. It was also a mix of Walden Pond kind of thing with her. So we went to some remote area in Kerala. There's a group of 20 of us, all like yuppie city people, and then you're like, shit, we have to draw water from a well. Where's our television? Who's cooking? Everyone, nobody knew how to cook. And it was like a really like a failed experiment. But we all believe in this Marxist artist thing. We were all artists, but like pathetic doers, let's just say. So anyway, so that then we landed up getting a more realistic picture. But we really tried with that Marxist thing. And then, you know, now when I think about Marxism, I find it a very dangerous trend, particularly in academia. It's like this neo-Marxist theory, because the idea as it's been applied over this long period of time has led us to so much violence and death, and we casually just revive it in academia. If you talk to an Eastern European, it's like saying we are, you know, reviving neo-Nazism or something, like, you know, and we do this so seamlessly because we love that idea. And I think that we have to understand a good idea when played out empirically in many different contexts, and it's chronically failing, is telling us something, that the very premise of that idea is misunderstanding humanity. So I've had a reality check, and also in terms of capitalism, right? People are so hating of capitalism that it's a dirty word. But if you talk to many contexts in the global south, they actually really like capitalism, because capitalism means something else. It means an expansion of choice. It means that markets are working, because the state has been so oppressive in so many ways, like the license Raj in India, which chose X and Y to be able to be the ones who do the market, very Soviet style. And it was absolutely unfair, right? So it's so funny that I moved from this end to this end, saying, okay, this is much more reasonable. The question is, we need guardrails. In the end of the day, we need guardrails, and that is fundamental, which means something like we have a minimum wage. We should have a maximum wage, right? I've forgotten what her name is, but she's this author who's actually written this book on this, and I think it's a really good point. It's so perverse that Jeff Bezos became a trillionaire during the COVID crisis. That's extraordinarily perverse. Or that Elon Musk today, I think I read, like, he's going to make 60 billion as a salary. Why would can anyone's work be worth 60 billion, right? So we need to have a maximum wage, sort of like where you can't earn as much. And I do subscribe to that. So in that sense, is that Marxist? I don't think so. It's more about guardrails, which are more decent, because people are not saying that everyone should earn the same and have the exact same task, but it's about the spectrum, which allows people to not create such a perverse situation where we disengage from one another and lose the empathy with one another, you know. And I think there's a sort of and we need to think closely on what those guardrails are. I mean, it's a cop-out when we write off entire systems of capitalism and Marxism without actually pulling out good ideas from any of these systems as we build something which actually will be working, you know, for our society. So.
Do we have time for another question, Vicky?
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Okay, so maybe I can ask a question. I was wondering, Payal, about two things. One is, there's something going on with the sound.
That's a 5 minute alarm.
5 minute. I see. Okay, not me. Okay. One thing I was wondering was differences between the expectations or aspirations of women across, say, India, Bangladesh, and Kenya. Did you say? That was one question. The other question was that you mentioned that in your book you had also people from industry with chapters in it, and I wondered about, did they work with you over a period of time, and if so, did their ideas change as they, as the empirical kind of gathered steam?
Yeah, so two very good questions. So one is that women's aspirations, for example, many of the women, they said they want to do their care responsibilities, because in many ways they're like, I want to be a good housewife. This is not a compromise, and the work is supplemental. So look, it takes a long time to shift mindsets, right? But for them, their identity is still, I am the wife, I'm the mother, I'm the caretaker, I'm going to do all this work, and then I will add it. So will it infringe on my care work? But what we realized is, so we were working with Mishu, for example, the reselling platform, that also recognizes that in order to reach out to potential workers for the platform, which they had to approach an entire family. So you can't think in individual terms, you have to think about family units. So if I want a woman worker, I approach the full family, the husband, and it seems like it's subscribing to that patriarchal system, but it's about quiet and slow kinds of feminism that emanate, because over time, over the 3 years, they were recording that women started to get money, and then the men, whether it's the husbands, the fathers, saw that it was making a difference. And, men started to take on more care work. It happened incrementally, but over the time, women also started to exercise their voice a little louder in the family. And so we tend to, think of agency in a very forceful term, and as if it's going to, push against, and you're screaming loud to the public that I'm going to be a feminist, I'm going to say no to this. But actually, it happens much slower and glacially, but very importantly, in meaningful terms. And so we were able to track that. And Mishu also said that they found that even women gained more confidence over the time. So they would also volunteer to be on their videos, to, for live streaming, etc., and embrace more technology. Initially, they said, I don't do anything with technology. So this goes very much at the heart of how people, everyday literacy, and how that's tied to the way in which we see ourselves, the way we build our confidence, because it's not just about skill set or upskilling, as you say, right? But it comes down to what is my role in this, in the society, family life. So I think that's just one example, but multiple of working with the industry and with the people, how that happens. So, but given the time, we can continue that work later. But thank you so much. I'm looking forward to listening to the panel and continuing this conversation.
Thanks very much, everyone. We'll have morning tea now. Is that right? And we'll come back here at 10:45. Thanks, everyone. Slight typo on the slide. It's 10:45, not 11:45. So, do you want to log back in so I can change that? Yeah. Thanks so much.
No, but like you're doing it.
I got it here.
Oh,